Yeah.
Yeah, I remember I call it a 5-month tour in pharmaceutical sales, which I was not a big fan of, primarily because you are given white lines that you really have to play within, right? I mean, the FDA is telling you what you can and cannot say. And as a person who loves to sell, I really couldn't sell, right? I was almost more like a walking and talking billboard for the pharmaceutical company based on some regulatory action that had to be taken. So I imagine when you're taking that out to marketing and a little bit more broad spectrum approach to how you're communicating with people, it's much of the same.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was a committee of people at some of the companies I worked with that reviewed all of the messaging that we put out, reviewed every word that was said in the videos before they were published to make sure they were in line with the claims that we were allowed to make. So yeah, heavy scrutiny went into the process of developing and distributing the content, but that is no reason not to do it. It's a great opportunity for medical companies.
Yeah, I love that. And, we kicked off by talking about the buyer journey, right? Or even just a deep understanding and knowledge of the buyer. So before we dive in too deep into some of those tactical things, maybe we zoom out for folks a little bit and talk about what are those first steps that a marketing organization should take, regardless of size, really, right? I mean, I think the fundamentals apply to everybody. So what are some of those, and thinking through that lens of medical, right? Knowing that down the line, you're going to have to go through all this scrutiny from the FDA, from your legal and compliance department and things. What are the things that we should know and start to dive into understanding the buyer to set that stage?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's assume that the company is commercial. The product has been approved in whatever market they're going into. So we're not talking like very early stage. We're trying to figure out what product we should build. Let's assume that they've already built the product and they have that in line. I mean, the first step is getting out in the market and understanding your customers on a day-to-day basis, where they spend their time, what sources of information are they looking at, what's important to them, what's their general personality like, how are we supposed to communicate with them effectively. I've had a lot of success in the healthcare space doing job shadowing. So, spending days in an ICU or an emergency room with the clinicians that were delivering the care. And when you see them do something, being able to step back afterward and say, hey, why did you choose that device? Why did you choose the setting on that device? If you could have done it differently, would you have tried this strategy, or why wouldn't you have? And just by being able to really entrench yourself in their world, it gives you such powerful capabilities when you develop marketing messaging and when you're creating content and things like that.
Yeah, I love that. Getting entrenched in their world and from the perspective of a ride along or just really getting to understand people. One of the things that you hear often in the healthcare world, especially if you're selling to a healthcare provider, whether it's a physician or someone in the operating room, is their inaccessibility. What are some of those things that you've seen break down some of those barriers? Obviously, it helps to understand who they are on the front end, but does that message get through if they're completely inaccessible?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, when we're trying to understand the buyer, typically we're going in with existing relationships, right? So we already have a way in. The accessibility barrier is broken down. But then when you're trying to scale your message to people that are unaware of your brand or don't believe in your product or whatever the case may be, the first step is to understand. You have to trigger some awareness in some way. You mentioned accessibility. And it's happening at a high rate right now, where sales reps are having a lot of trouble accessing potential buyers. Right? There's credentialing to ensure that we know who's getting into a hospital. It controls reps. I mean, email is a tough way. So, like, how are you going to reach these people? Companies right now use conferences as a method to reach people. They use a lot of outbound selling. So whether that's actually riding and going out in the field and visiting hospitals, or cold emailing or cold calling to access stakeholders. What I figured out like 3 years ago, I was in a pediatric ICU. It was 1 a.m. At that time, it's very quiet. There's not a lot of visitors and things like that. So you're just observing and seeing what's happening with people. And most nurses, most respiratory therapists, I didn't have a lot of access to the actual physicians, but these people are at that time spending time on, when they're not taking care of patients, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. And so if you're thinking as a medical device company, and that's just complete observation, and if you're in a different B2B world and you're on a train and you're commuting to work on a train, and you look around, everyone's on their phone and they're using one of those couple platforms where they're looking at their email. And so taking that data point that I was seeing, and understanding that when you're selling a medical technology, most companies go after directly at the decision maker. Those people are very hard to access. Right. And so at scale, we can hit influencers of sales that influence what technologies use, that can get you access to the right stakeholders by figuring out how to communicate and educate them on the product or, modality or whatever that you're offering. And so we took that back and started to use specifically Facebook advertising targeted at job titles like emergency room nurse or ICU nurse or respiratory therapist or emergency medicine physician, and deliver, really top of the funnel awareness material. Like, this clinical study was published. Here's a summary of it. Here's what I think the key takeaways of what you need for it. And those were written by very, very knowledgeable people in science and research from our company.
Yeah,
and so all we're exactly. And so all we're doing is finding a simple and concise way to generate awareness of this study, because a lot of people don't either it takes a long time to actually understand that the study was published and what it means. And a lot of people misinterpret them. And so with this method, we get immediately upon publication awareness of the clinical study that's important for the product or service that we're selling, as well as controlling the message of how it's interpreted.
Got it. Okay.
And so typically,
I was going to say, this sounds like a huge opportunity for marketers that they're probably not being tapped into. And I oftentimes like to think about it from the other side of the aisle, because I think the sales and marketing alignment piece is pretty critical. If you have sales now being more and more limited with access to decision makers, and we're trying to find ways to, start to influence people in that, what kind of feedback, if any, have you gotten from sales counterparts with that approach and starting to raise that awareness from the sales side?
Yeah. So to your point, sales and marketing alignment is so critical. And so the two pieces need to understand where they fit together to achieve the common goal. And so when working with sales reps, the reps that really embraced the strategy, when we delivered a lead that said, we marketed to them, they come to our website, they say, hey, I want a demo of your product. That rep jumps on it, they go. Those sales close between 50 and 75% faster than a traditional sales cycle, because you've done all of the education up front, instead of trying to convince a buyer in a demo that your technology is the right one to use or your therapy is the right one to use. They're already bought into that, and now you just need to help them navigate their own buying process, right? Which is very complex in a healthcare environment as well.
Right. Interesting on, the experimentation. I think marketers in general should be more open to experimentation. I think there's a lot of opportunity to just try and fail with things, because you're going to get a lot of inputs and a lot of data that you can start to draw some better conclusions with. And, part of marketing is art and part of it's science, right? So be a little bit creative, curious, and A/B test and understand what's going on. But you mentioned social platforms where these influencers are sitting, right, on the train, on the bus, where it may be, whether it be Facebook, Instagram, whatnot. That seems great if you're targeting maybe a small, new to the market med device company that is a little bit more willing to take risk. How does that message resonate when you go to the, Fortune 500 med device company who's been in the market for 100 years, and, they're trying to not lose market share to maybe the younger up and coming company?
Yeah. So, I think that's most of my experience is in small medical device companies that have initial traction are trying to scale quickly and are typically competing with a company that's between 10 and 100 times the size of them in terms of revenue. And so when you're David and you're going up against Goliath, you can't go and spend $200,000 to put on a symposium at a trade show. You can't act the same way as those big companies. And the truth is, those big companies, they get, because of their scale and their awareness, it hides a lot of the marketing inefficiencies because buyers immediately recognize their brand and will come to them. The problem is that over time, that's going to play itself out. And so if we look at other different industries, like let's take retail, for example, there are big brands like Nike that are having small chunks of their market share pulled away by all of these small companies. And so that's going to happen to the big, I mean, the big strategics are acquiring companies once they get to a size and they're in the right market. And so they kind of eat them up. But when a small company can market effectively and they have a better product, that is how one company starts to move and eat market share from another that's not marketing effectively anymore.
Got it. Yeah. And I think that's, a commentary, we do some work in the healthcare space as all, but we do work across, lots of different types of industries. And you do see that. And that's one of the challenges when you do have such great awareness as an organization, because you are such a big brand within your space, maybe not a household name, but a household name within your particular slice of heaven. And big companies are just afraid to take those risks that you see the smaller companies take. And it does create somewhat of an equalizer, right? For marketing organizations, it levels the playing field to a certain extent where you can go grab up some market share. And depending on your strategy and market, maybe part of your strategy is an exit and you can fill a niche within the market that the big guy might want to purchase from you. And, their growth strategy may be more on acquisition than just on organic growth itself because they've gotten so big. So I think some of those things are good, not even from a marketing perspective, but for organizations to think about as they're in market, depending on their stage of growth, what they're trying to do. Are you, funded? Are you bootstrapped or are you funded by PE? What does the PE firm want? Those are things that could actually directly influence how you go and how you look at the market and how you go to market. So those are awesome insights. One note on that I thought was interesting. Sorry to interrupt you. I just thought it just kind of wanted to get this in here because I think it's important. You had mentioned companies not having an appetite for risk to use these types of platforms. And I actually think that it's different than risk aversion. I think it's that they fundamentally don't believe that it can be effective. And so therefore they're not building, they're not open to, at least my experience in a couple of companies, like I was told, there is no way that we are ever going to have a physician buy our product through Facebook. And a year later, 76 new accounts predominantly generated through Facebook advertising. 76 new hospitals have decided to adopt the technology because of the awareness generated through Facebook ads that were targeted at the right physicians with the right message. And so just to kind of bring that back, I think that companies just don't fundamentally believe in it. And so when you look at the difference in how companies are evolving, they're not trying to build core competencies of content creation, creative, digital distribution, marketing and sales technology, infrastructure, as far as e-commerce or other types of digital transformation activities. They're not attempting to build these things, and it's not going to happen tomorrow. But not having those core competencies as buyers continue to move that way, you're going to have a Amazon-like play with a medical technology distributor that is selling online that has the best way, whether it's Amazon or a different platform. And if you don't have the e-com yourself, you're going to end up paying them 25 to 40% margin to do what you could have done if you had just had the foresight to build it yourself. That's interesting. And, I wonder, as, companies that are scientific in nature, right? If you're in the healthcare space and you're creating a medical device, you likely have a scientific background. If the marketer, I'm trying to speak to the marketer, the person who wants to champion, the person who's working for the big guy and they want to champion this type of approach internally. Can you take a scientific approach and you say, listen, I have a hypothesis. I want to test that hypothesis and carve out a subgroup, right? And prove or disprove it, right? And bring some of that data to the table. Because, obviously what you did was, somewhat scientific in that the proof is in the pudding, right? We added new accounts. It was primary to this channel, but almost come up with a small pilot group where you can say, this is the subset I want to break out. This is what I want to pilot. This is the process by which we're going to do it. And these are the results we're going to look for. If we get a positive here, we're going to go forward with maybe another. We get a negative, then we're going to, find a new hypothesis and test it. Is that a little bit of the approach that you took?
Yeah, absolutely. Starting small, allocating, a couple $1,000s to some different channels, and seeing what happens. So at the beginning of an experiment, you usually have to look at leading metrics. Medical device sales cycles can be, 90, 180,
right,
very long. And so you're not going to get that immediate type of information about, yeah, this is working, yeah, this is not. So we use leading metrics such as, as early as website visits or cost per clicks, or qualitative engagement, whether on an ad or a video or something like that. And then we move to the middle, which is like, are we generating inbound opportunities? How are those coming through? Are they the right job titles? Are they the right stakeholders? Are they at the right accounts? And then if you get that information, then from there, we call it passing off to sales, but we operate in a place where marketing is supposed to be looking at the whole revenue. So we're the whole revenue process. So we're tracking those leads through the sales process. And we understand that when they come inbound and they're educated, they close faster, we win them at a higher rate. Typically the average deal size is about the same. And so when you think about if we can generate some amount of opportunities there to balance out the long sales cycle big accounts, at first it helps make your sales team way more efficient. It makes their job easier for these small accounts to start getting revenue in the door. It also allows them to spend a lot more time on the big accounts, average contract values over 100K, that can really move the needle for the organization.
You brought up a great point there about tying whatever your experiment is to revenue, because, that's one of the charges that we've been thinking about holistically, not just in medical, but making sure that whatever you're doing, whatever you're experimenting with, as a marketer, you're tying it back to some sort of revenue. And, healthcare could be one of the most challenging spaces to do that because of some of the things you outlined, because there is such a long sales cycle. And oftentimes it's not a direct path, from rep to sale, right? There's not always a signature involved. There's a lot of different things that are nuanced in healthcare that makes that a little bit different. So love the tie to revenue. I think that, we need to be collectively pushing more and more marketing departments to own revenue alongside with their sales counterparts, and it'll just help things get better. One of the pivots I wanted to make maybe a little bit broader than just healthcare specifically, but the topic came up, I think it was yesterday, around audience programs. And that was a term that we use here a little bit internally, and some of the components that make up an audience program. And I thought it fit really well into your concept of really a deep understanding of the buyer and what they care about and who they are. And some of the components that we outlined are understanding total addressable market and ideal customer profiles. Who are the members of a buying committee? You talked about influencers and decision makers in that. What are some of those other people that surround it, and having deep understanding via the persona around that? Buyer journey, buyer maps, those types of things. What are some of the things in a audience program, or maybe you call it something different, that you've seen be super successful for getting a deep understanding of the buyer?
Yeah, absolutely. So just a couple clarifying questions on how you use those. Those seem like tools that facilitate being able to learn about customers. So somebody goes out, learns about the customers, completes these documents, and then the main purpose is to share them across the organization. Is that the right understanding? Like how are those pieces being used, or is everybody responsible for customer research? Just a clarifying question.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Part of what we're, trying to urge people to do across organizations is to really stop just going off of gut, right? The gut has its place, But what I'm trying to get away from a lot of times is the CEO who says, we need to be going after financial services companies because we did $1 million deal in financial services last year and we need more of those, right? Well, the data may prove that that $1 million deal is a huge outlier. And actually, if you spin your wheels in financial services, you lose more than you win, but you did ring the cash register once on that $1 million deal. But in fact, you know, maybe manufacturing is what's keeping the engine running. And really, instead of just trusting your gut, which, you know, a lot of great companies have been built on the guts of great leaders. So I don't want to dismiss that completely. But I think in marketing, there's a huge opportunity because there's so much data available. And I think it gets a little bit overwhelming, right? So what can we do with the data to help us understand what does a company that really looks good for us look like? And once we understand that, who are the people within that company that actually buy from us, who are involved, and what do they do? How do they talk? Where do we find them? To your point, where do they hang out? Right? So what are all those different things, and how can we start to aggregate all that data from all these different sources, whether it be a CRM, a marketing automation system, an ERP, a transactional system, all sorts of different things.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things that I think about when I think about, you know, marketing leadership, taking the focus of understanding the customer and then disseminating that down to their team.
Yeah, absolutely. So I break this into kind of maybe 4 quadrants is a good way to look at it. First, you have the data types. You have either qualitative or quantitative data. So that's one piece. And then you can look at in another side of the quadrant, you have existing business and future business. So one of the first steps I always take is I analyze quantitatively my existing customer base. What are the common trends about them? Maybe they're a hospital of this certain size, or they have this type of department, or there's commonalities typically in your customer base. Probably 80% fall into those, and then there's 20% that maybe don't. That's one step. On the qualitative side, you know, with your existing customer base, you can go and do field rides or calls or whatever you need to do to collect qualitative information from your customers. That's how are you using the product, what value you're getting, what other things do you use with it, whatever questions there might be to understand your current customer base. That's one side of the equation, and then I look at the future. And so one thing that you hadn't mentioned that I found a lot of value in is doing targeted market research surveys. So you can find, you know, let's say you have your current customer base, they fit into this ICP, but then you want to look at a new market for financial services, for instance. And so you know that you're going to financial services, and you're looking for the, I don't know, let's just call it market analyst for lack of a better. So you have your specific persona inside of that industry. So let's go and buy data. So we have contact information, and let's distribute a survey to understand what these people are all about. And so maybe we want to understand what products they're using. We want to understand demographic information. We want to understand where they research products. We want to understand how they prefer to buy products. We want to understand their affinity to our products. We want to understand, price elasticity relative to other options. There's a ton of different things. So that is a combination of quantitative and qualitative that you can get from a survey. And then you got to go out and do targeted qualitative market research and meet your potential buyers. And so that was a really long and hopefully comprehensive way of explaining how I think about both understanding your existing customer base and also thinking about pursuing either new markets, new verticals, new opportunities.
No, I like it a lot because it helps break it down into some tangible things that, people can really focus on. I tend to be very big picture, so I appreciate the drill down into some very specific things that, we can share with folks to help them, start to dive into how they can use data that they may have available to them, and then how they can go and curate some data to help accomplish that goal, and think of it in those different quadrants because, it's two different sides of the equation, but they're both very, very important.
And so going back to your point on whether in healthcare, either risk aversion or just not thinking that it works, one of the things that I did to start to convince senior leadership that this was a good idea to pursue was I did a market research survey of our target buyers, physicians, respiratory therapists, and nurses. And one of the questions we asked is, do you use social media platforms to learn about medical technology? And the answer was 75%. I don't know the exact figure, but it was a majority said yes. And then we did a drill down and said, which platforms do you use? And the rank order was YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn.
Wow. Unbelievable.
And so that gave us some really targeted information about our existing customer base of which platforms to use. And then we have to use intuition about how to use them. And then we take that to senior leadership or whoever the decision maker is about how we market and how we allocate budget and say, look, our buyers are telling us that they're learning here and we're not there. So how are we expecting to educate them? We need to be in the places where our customers want to learn.
Wow. That's really awesome stuff, Chris. I really appreciate it. So I think, unless you have anything else you want to cover, maybe sign it off for today and we'll get back together and do this again sometime.
Yeah, I would love to do it again. Maybe we go with a little broader strokes. We got deep into healthcare this time. And by the way, most of the concepts that we talked about here, although it was contextual to healthcare, are existing in almost every B2B industry.